And then we'll line up our last speaker, which is Barb Frick. Escape here. Is this out? And then I'll also be handing out the WSDA pesticide credits. Today's class is worth 4 credits, as well as the evaluation. If you'd kindly take a moment to fill out the evaluation, it is 2-sided, front and back. We use the information that you provide us to improve upon the workshop for the next year. So please help me in welcoming Barb Frick.
Thank you. I worked with the Produce Safety Alliance, and we are based out of Cornell University. I actually live down in the Corvallis, Oregon area, and so I represent the Pacific Northwest region. And the Produce Safety Alliance was actually formed back in 2010 at Cornell University, and it's a collaborative effort between USDA, United States Department of Agriculture, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and Cornell. And Cornell is actually charged with given the opportunity to come out and help growers learn about the produce safety rule. And that's why we have the name Produce Safety Alliance. And so I wanted to let you know that I am not FDA. I did not come up with the Food Safety Modernization Act. So don't start throwing tomatoes at me. But I'm here to help give you as much information as I can to help you learn a little bit more about it. How many of you have attended talks before on the food FSMA? Okay, PSR. When you look at this slide here, which of those products up there is not covered in the produce safety rule? Are strawberries covered? Yes. Yes. Lettuce? Yes. Mushrooms? No. Yes, they are. No. Sweet corn? No. No. Why not? It's not normally eaten raw. You get a gold star, first gold star of the day. So when we talk about the produce safety rule, one of the things you're going to learn is it refers to products that are only eaten raw, fruits and vegetables, produce. And sweet corn, yeah, I know, some of us are going, how many of you do eat sweet corn raw? Yes. The majority of us probably do. The majority of Americans don't. But I know there are some really interesting crops on the that get put under the rule. The one that really flustered me, and I asked in an audience once, artichokes. How many of you have ever eaten a raw artichoke? Can you even think about eating a raw artichoke? But one person said they had. But artichokes are actually covered under this rule, which I was very surprised to find out. So we're going to talk about the produce safety rule and what it means for everybody here. And if I can get it to go, maybe I have to go this way. Ah, that's why. So we'll talk about what the rule actually is. We'll look at some of the compliance dates and some of the definitions that are really important for you as growers to understand. And then finally, we'll finish with what the requirements are. Obviously, we're not going to hit everything. Otherwise, we would be here for the 7-hour training that we give to growers who are going through the training. So I will not subject you to that. Basically, the Food Safety Modernization Act is a rule that's really focused on the growing, harvesting, and post-harvest handling of produce. And really the focus is on prevention and not detection, which is really important. And it's the first ever mandatory regulation that has hit the fruits and vegetables for a long, long time. And so in the past, what's been driving how growers are growing things? What's had a big impact? The buyers, right? And so this is really the first federal regulation as far as safety for food safety goes that's coming down from the federal government. One thing to keep in mind, I know some people get really worked up about it and they're worried about complying. And one of the things to remember is this regulation, even though it's a law, you're going to see that it's going to take a while to implement. And so we don't like to have growers all upset about it and getting excited about some of the things. There's still a lot of guidance that's going to be coming out from FDA because there's still quite a few questions out there on how it's going to be implemented. So it was actually signed into law back in November 2015, and 60 days after that, that's when it became effective in January of 2016. And it really depends on the size of your business when you need to comply. So if you make over $500,000, then you have 2 years from when it became law. So it would be next January in 2018 that you need to be able to comply with the law. And so we'll talk about what some of the big things you'll need to look at. If you're a small business between 250K to 500K, you have 3 years to comply. And then if you're just a very small business between 25,000 to 250, you have 4 years. Now the big thing, if you notice on the bottom, there it says compliance dates for some of the agricultural water requirements allow for an additional 2 years, which is a really big deal because water requirements are one of the things that they're still working out. And so there's plenty of time to not panic about some of the water requirements because they're probably going to get flushed out, pun intended, some of the things that are in the rule right now. So there are exclusions and exemptions. So the first exclusion is what you're growing. And so if it's rarely consumed raw, you do not fall under the produce safety rule. So things like the sweet corn, which we mentioned, potatoes, those are rarely consumed raw. And there's a whole, I think there's a list of 33 things that are excluded. Other vegetables or fruits that you may think of, can you think of the things that are rarely consumed raw? What about winter squash? Rarely consumed raw. Summer squash, they are covered because they are consumed raw. Asparagus, it's not covered under the rule. Another interesting one that I find is cranberries are not covered under the rule. But they actually looked through some of the data on how people use the products, and that's what they ruled. There are things, and let's say that the list is not exhaustive. They are made, even if it's not listed, that doesn't mean it's not covered. We had one training that we went to, and it was a tropical fruit, was not listed, and we found out from FDA, if it's not listed, it is covered until they put it on the not listed, which is rather interesting. But the other way people can be excluded is if their annual produce sale is less than $25,000 per year. So you don't need to follow the rules if you don't sell more than $25,000 a year. The next thing, you can be exempt from the rule if there is a processing step, a kill step. So for instance, if you grow tomatoes and they're made into tomato sauce, then you fall under a different rule and you're not under the fresh produce safety rule. And so that kill step moves you into a different part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, the Preventative Controls section versus the PSR. And there is also another exempt clause for annual food sales based on, and we'll talk about this, if you're selling to a qualified end user. The real key is whether your operation is covered under the produce safety rule or not is, even if you're not required by federal law, there may be grower requirements. You never know how growers are going to look at these things. And so it behooves everybody who's growing food. I mean, obviously, if you're raising food, you want to do it safely. But it's nice to know what the requirements are. Do you mind if I ask how many growers here are actually covered under the rule or think they're covered? Raise your hand, some of you. How many think you're not covered? Correct. Do you think you are covered under the produce safety rule? You fall in one of those categories? Okay. So this qualified exemption is an interesting one. The person who made this slide, I think differently than they do. I look at the second part of the question first. If the average monetary value of all food the farm sold during the 3-year preceding the applicable calendar year was less than $500,000, so if you sell less than $500,000, and over half of that, more than half of the monetary value of the farm food sold was directly to a consumer, and a qualified consumer end user. So a qualified end user is somebody who consumes the food. So if you sell at a farmer's market, if you have your food goes to a retail food establishment or a restaurant. So those are end users, qualified end users. And it happens to be in the same state or the same Indian reservation of the farm that produces food, and not more than 275 miles from the farm, then you are exempt. Because a senator got that exemption included in the rule. So the requirement is that you have to have a sign that states where the food came from at the establishment where you're selling it. But other than that, yeah, you're exempt from the rule. Now, if there is a food outbreak from your food, then you become covered under the rule. So you still have to have safe food practices, and the food you sell has to be safe. So the produce farms exempt from not covered by the rule, there are approximately 121,000 farms. They think 86,000 are going to be exempt or not covered, and 35,000 covered. That's what FDA has predicted.
Is that's in the first year or the next? Or
no, overall. Overall. Yes, question.
Didn't Washington State opt out of the sanctions? Do you know anything about that? There's a rumor I heard that they were not going to let anyone get that. Yeah, if you haven't heard of it.
I have not heard that. So states, so I guess the question, is, so you'd asked if Washington State had opted not to allow any exemptions. Roger, Roger, I don't want to put him on the spot, but he actually is from the Washington Department of Agriculture, and you would know more.
Not the FDA.
No, he's not FDA either.
If I understand correctly, is there's one of the thought processes when we adopt rules, it's possible that we may say, you know, everybody's got to be covered as the state adopts it.
Okay.
That hasn't happened yet. Okay. Somebody is talking, I don't know if that was real or not, but that would be a chance for, as an industry, to get with your representatives in the legislature and say, there's going to be something in front of the legislature next year. So this summer, they're going to actually put together discussions and meetings and that sort of stuff. And that's an option. I think they looked at that for the food rules, but I don't think they went that route. Okay. That's a good thing to keep.
Interesting question. So you keep reading more about that and get involved if it will impact you. Like anything, don't sit back and let things roll you over. Farm definition, what is a farm definition? It's, so part of the FSMA, there's the produce safety rule, and then there's also the preventative controls rule. And preventative controls rule for human food has to do with the processing, manufacturing. And so it's really important to know where your farm fits, because it may be possible that you fall under both rules depending on what your farm does. So it's really important to know what your farm does. I've gotten a lot of calls from people and they say, do I fall under the preventive controls rule, or do I fall in the produce safety rule? And it really depends on the operation and the owners. And FDA has added some clearance, but hopefully everybody knows where their operation falls. It's really important to know. So know where you stand. And because there was quite a bit of confusion on who owns property and 50% ownership, and it's very, very confusing at times, and where you would fall. So just be aware of that. So here are all the things we get to cover today. No, we're not going to cover all of these. These are all the different 13 subparts of the produce safety rule. And we're actually going to hit upon all the highlights that are really important for growers to know what they need to be responsible for, the big highlights. So some of the worker training requirements. You all have worker training requirements now. There may be some additional training requirements. As workers are hired, they need to be trained, and they need to be trained annually, year after that. It's really important that the training is in the language that they understand, really critical. And then one of the things that the produce safety rule says that workers must have a combination of education, training, and experience to perform their job requirements. And all the training must be documented. It's not only documented and have the worker sign and the person doing the training and what they were trained on, but then somebody from your operation actually has to come back through and do a second signature to review the documents. We are putting up, I will say, on our website, the last slide will be our website, at the Produce Safety Alliance, we're putting together a list of training documents required for the produce safety rule, and examples of them to give people an idea of what's needed. We have quite a bit of other information that we're trying to put up on our website, resources that people can use. So I want to push the website because there's a lot of good information there. One of the big things for the produce safety rule is there needs to be at least one supervisor or responsible party from a farm that has to complete the food safety training that is recognized by FDA as equivalent to the standardized curriculum. And right now, that curriculum is what the Produce Safety Alliance has put together. It's a one-day training. It's a 7 to 8 hour training, one day. And I'm sure it'll be offered here in a number of places all around the state. And it's just a one-time, after you attend the training, you get a certificate that says you've attended the training, and it's only a one and done. So it's not like every year that you have to do it. It's just a one-time thing right now. So any questions about that? Question?
I have a question on your previous slide.
Sure.
So considering the labor and how they move around, when it said training, they have to be trained. Does it have to be by your farm, or can they bring documentation that they have had this training?
It's supposed to be for your farm. Great question. It's supposed to be for your farm because they say every farm is different. Now, it could be a lot shorter for your farm if they have had other training, but there needs to be something from your farm. Question?
Is there a minimum hiring time they have to be employed? Is it like, could they be employed for 2 months and then one time to train?
Upon hiring is what the rule says. Because they may just be a harvest crew, but they need to have some type of training. So the other thing, let's go, oops, I'm going backwards actually, wrong way. So some of the training that is required, they need to have some food hygiene and food safety training is required. They definitely need to have the importance of health and hygiene for anybody, personnel or visitors. It's really important. Visitors too need to have training. It can be just a sign, but it's really critical that, you know, signage be put up. Really important. You want to know, have your workers know when to report illnesses. You know, your workers are your boots on the ground. They're the people that are actually doing things. So it only helps to have some training as much as you can make it cost effective. And then they also should be able to report food safety risks to supervisors. Any question? U-Picks, yeah, so the question was U-Picks and where visitors can and cannot go. We've had this discussion on even people who drive into the farm, where they can drive to. It's really, anybody who steps foot on your farm needs to have, you need to have signage up. You know, you must sign in at the office or whatever it may be. No pets, no animals, except service dogs. Not pets, can't say that. But no, you know, those types of things, you need to have signage. It's really important. I know, you kind of laugh, but
You can't say no pets.
no, say no animals. Don't say no dogs. People have brought raccoons as pets, so, you know, be careful.
But so if your home is on your farm, can you define a certain area that's
Yes.
not the farm?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, if your home is on the farm, yes, definitely.
You say the farm begins here.
Right. Packing areas, packing sheds, fields, all of those types of things. Keep those in mind. Yes. Yes. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's move on. All these people covered. Exclusions, you all know when you're going to be covered. What did I do? Go backwards again? I just
Yeah,
can't.
it's backwards.
I'm going backwards. I like going backwards.
You push the down arrow to advance this way.
It's this left-handed thing. My brain works correctly. So, okay, so we get the workers trained. Hygiene practices, you have to go through those very, very well. How long should people be washing their hands? What's the time limit? How many times do you sing happy birthday? Twice. 20 seconds. Do that the next time you go in the bathroom. 20 seconds. It's a long time. But the more you can work towards that, the better off you'll be. I know. And why do people want warm water? You know cold water causes arthritis, right? It doesn't, but that's a myth out there. So, washing hands is really critical. Washing and drying hands. Gloves, if you don't have to use gloves, but if you use them, they need to be kept in a sanitary manner. Hand jewelry, things like that cannot be cleaned, has to be covered. No eating, chewing gum. Chewing gum is considered eating, or tobacco products in a covered area, meaning where you're packing in an enclosed area. So that's very important. People who are doing field harvesting, it's really critical to have an evaluation to look to see when produce cannot be harvested, if there's any contamination risks. What are some possibilities for it getting contaminated? Wildlife. So obviously you're more likely to have a problem with strawberries, something on the ground, versus something, your blueberries that are growing on a bush. Where do you most likely to have problems with on the bush? Birds. Bird excrement. It's important that all the harvest containers be clean, and people report problems. It's really critical. What's considered dropped produce? Anything that drops to the ground cannot be picked up and put back in the containers. Now, there are some things that grow on the ground, things like carrots, cantaloupe, those grow on the ground, those are fine to be picked up. But, you know, when apples and fruit drops to the ground, it cannot be picked up again. Question in the back. And the other thing is some products grown actually here that are actually dropped to the ground to be harvested. What would those be? Nuts. Almonds, not here, but and filberts, definitely. So those are things. So moving on to another area that there's concerns with the food safety area is untreated biological soil amendments. Basically, we're talking about manure. And if it's not treated, manure can carry human pathogens. And so it needs to be treated, composted to eliminate or decrease that risk. And so any of the following soil amendments are considered untreated. So raw manure, it hasn't been treated, aged or stacked manure. When does stacked manure become compost?
It's heated to the required amount of degrees and days.
He's gone through this already. When it's heated to the scientifically validated treatment, and it's gone through the whole treatment process, and it's gone through the curing process, then it is considered treated. It is not, as it sits and ages 5 years, 10 years, considered composted then. So aged manure or stacked manure is never considered treated unless it's gone through a process, and that process has been recorded. Correct. Untreated manure teas. Does anybody here fertilize with manure-based teas? Okay, so an untreated manure tea would be one that you have not used composted manure, and it becomes untreated, and the water you use has to have no generic E. coli water test, and it cannot have things like molasses, any other products added to it. It becomes untreated as soon as you put any of those additives in. It's really critical to know that. That information is all written in the produce safety rule, what makes it untreated. So, or if you have any soil amendment that gets mixed with raw manure, then it becomes untreated. So what's really important about that is they don't want untreated products, raw manure, being applied to fields. Currently, FDA has a no application interval, meaning not that you can put it on raw manure on, because they don't say that you can't, but they're doing more research, they're doing more risk assessment to trying to decide what they feel is the safest amount of time that you can apply raw manure to a field. And so untreated soil amendments, raw manure must not be directly applied to any harvestable portion of a crop. And if it has been treated, composted to a scientifically valid process, then it can be applied. They say 0 days, but the longer you can wait, the better. Now, does that mean you can't use raw manure at all? You can use raw manure, but people are following right now the National Organic Program standards for applying raw manure to fields. So if it's a crop where it would touch the ground, it's 120 days, and if it's a crop that's grown off the ground, 90 days. But FDA is still doing research on that. Animals, wildlife and domesticated animals, it's important to keep them out of your field if at all possible. And the real big key is to monitor for those animals, and right before harvest, look in those areas, monitor throughout the growing season, and before harvest to go into that area and check and see if there's any contamination, and can you harvest in that area. Really critical, because you can't harvest material that has poop on it, right? No animal excrement allowed. Really, really critical. So everybody knows there have been instances, I know in Oregon a couple of years ago, deer got into a strawberry field. There was pretty heavy deer pressure, and some of those berries went to farmers markets, and people did get sick, and so it does happen, so be aware of that. Probably one of the most interesting parts of the produce safety rule is the agriculture water requirements. Some of you have sat through talks before, and are you aware of some of the water issues? Yep, okay. So agriculture water is any water that touches the covered produce. So if you're using drip irrigation, would that be considered agriculture water? No. If you're dripping it on carrots, correct. But if you're dripping it on an above ground plant and that water isn't touching the fruit, the produce, then it's not considered agriculture water. If you spray the crop with a pesticide spray, would that be considered agriculture water? Yes. And so when we start talking about agriculture water, it's important to keep in mind how you're using the water. So the three things that you need to be concerned about water is your water source. Does anybody here use municipal water? Wow, some of you do. You guys are really lucky because they do, well, they do, yeah, yes and no, right? It's pretty expensive, but they do all the treatment for you. You don't have to worry about, you just need to get the once a year water test from where you get your water. So the source of the water. So municipal water supplies should be quite safe. If you're using a well, that would be middle in risk because it should be, you know, depending on the depth of the well and how good the system is, how well the system is, yeah. So that would be middle in risk. And then the highest risk would be an open water source. Canals, ponds, anything that's open to the environment would be higher risk. Okay, so that's the first thing. The application method, obviously, if you're overhead irrigating, more of a risk than if you're drip irrigating and not getting your crop touching the fruit or vegetable. And then when you apply the water, the closer you are to harvest, the higher your risk. So if you can hold off watering further from harvest, because what happens over time is if that water has any microbes in it, the sun, the air, they die off over time in exposure to the environment. So those are things to consider when you think about your production water. So one of the things that the produce safety rule requires is all systems and distribution systems should be looked at yearly, an annual inspection, which makes sense. You want to keep your water source free from debris, trash, animals, and all those good things, of course. This is what is very confusing to people and is a little different. Do most of you who have your own well or use a canal, do you guys test your water usually? Yes. So the water tests that are required for the produce safety rule right now are a test that is called the modified MTEC, and it's 1603 is what it is. And you will get a number of how many generic E. coli per 100 mils of water. And so typically what most people use now is a different testing method, and they get most probable number and instead of an actual number. And so this is a different method than most labs use to test the water. I guess there's one lab in Washington State that uses the method that is required for the produce safety rule. And one of the big problems with using the test right now is you have 6 hours from the time you take the sample to get it to the lab to be analyzed, which the people who made the rule are realizing now that may be impossible for some areas to be able to get the test done and get it to a lab within 6 hours because it needs to be run within 8 hours. So there's some problems. But what they're trying to do is get what we call a geometric mean and a statistical threshold value, STV value, for the water. It's a water profile. And basically, you'll take a water test and then you put it into a water calculator and you come up with these values. It's not easy to do. You can do it longhand. The math is not fun. We have a method, we have some of the information on how to get those values, but it's really a water calculator that can be used online to determine these values. And it's something that's done over, it's not one test and you're done. So if you're using a surface water source for your production water, you would need to test, you need to get at least 20 samples over a 2 to 4 year period. So remember the water requirements, even if you are subject to the rule next year, you don't have to do those water requirements. You don't have to start until you start the water sampling next year and you have an extra 2 years to get them in. So that's a good thing. But basically, if you're using surface water, you need to gather 20 tests over that 2 to 4 year period. And then you'll look at that, and then every year thereafter, you take one sample. So what we're doing is you start here and you come down 5 samples after, and you jump 5 samples off. And if your water quality profile doesn't represent, if it looks like it's gone way out of whack, then you go back. But if your profile does not meet the geometric mean, you can actually apply corrective measures. And so you can apply a harvest time between, if your values are out of that 126 or 410 value, if they fall above those ranges, then you can wait to harvest your crop and you get die off. And it's pretty significant what they'll allow you, 4 days for die off, what your values can be before you harvest your crop. So you wait to not use the water on the crop for 4 days if you need to. So you can do that die off. You can also do some problems with, do some things. You can treat the water. So there are a number of things you can do. When it comes to the whole water, though, I will say that they are really reviewing it, and FDA will be coming out with further guidance because they realize it's going to be a burden, and they're afraid that a lot of people aren't going to be able to actually do what they would like. So if you use a groundwater source, you only have to test 4 times to develop that profile, and then once every year. Public water supply, you just have to get the test results from the public water company. So if you're using surface water, those are the places where you really, for every source of your water, you have to have a test. So that's the surface water, 20 tests can be more expensive. So that's the big one, the surface water one, 20 or more times over a period of 2 to 4 years. So that's a huge increase for a lot of people. So water that's used after harvesting, you must know how you're going to use it, how to maintain its quality, and to manage it and monitor it. So that's the important thing. Many of you probably use antimicrobial products, sanitizers in the water, in some of your post-harvest water. Does anybody here? Yeah? So they must be labeled for food products. Sanitizers are not, they don't actually wash the fruit. They're actually meant to prevent contamination. And there's lots of sanitizers available out there. Some of them are even organic. So the test for post-harvest water is different than water that you'd use for production water. And that's no detectable generic E. coli. So any water that touches the fruit, any water that comes in contact with food contact surfaces, any water that's made to use ice, washing workers' hands, that can have no detectable generic E. coli. So it's a different variables so needed. So that's important to know. And you cannot use untreated surface water for these purposes. Okay, anything tools, equipment, sanitation, it all gets back to everything that you have must be adequately cleaned and properly maintained. Really important when you go, being able to take machines apart. Sometimes it's really difficult. There's been a lot of changes over the last few years as some of the hazards, things have come out. I know you guys, thank goodness you're not involved in some of the cantaloupe problems, using old carpet, things like that can't be cleaned and sanitized. It's really important to use materials that you can clean and sanitize, and all the tools that you use. Good housekeeping practices, really important when it comes to any post-harvest activities. And cleaning and sanitizing, this is my favorite. Some people don't know the difference between cleaning and sanitizing, and so the difference is cleaning is removing the dirt, making sure the dirt is gone, and sanitizing is treating a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. And so one of the things we always talk about is, first removing the dirt, maybe just sweeping it off, hosing, gentle water spray, not pressure washing, because you don't want to spread everything all over. But then using a detergent, moving over here to the second part, using a detergent and scrubbing. One of the talks we gave, we had a person who had a small diversified farm, and they had a stainless steel table. And some days they were cutting up chickens on the table, and at another time they were putting their fresh produce on it. And he, quote unquote, cleaned and sanitized his table. And after we'd gone through this presentation, he said, oh, the table's always so slick after I slaughter the chickens. He didn't realize there was a different detergent to use to remove all the fats and things from the chicken to really clean the surface versus just, using there's different detergents depending on what type of materials you're using on your table. It's really important. But really rinsing it off and then applying your sanitizer, critical. So keep those things in mind. Going backwards again. Transportation, anything that you use to transport your crop, think about the cleanliness of that. Can it be clean? When the Produce Safety Alliance, we were actually put together to work with small and medium-sized farms. And when you think about trucks that go to market, there are some that are carrying maybe livestock as well as produce. Think about that, really think carefully on whether you want to do that, if that's a good idea. Probably not the best practice. If you can get away from that, it's a good idea. Any equipment that you use, minimize that contact with potential contact with contamination, animals versus produce, which is really critical. So if you'd like more information on the produce safety rule, some of the things that we've put together, the materials such as the records that may be helpful, the water calculators, feel free to go to our Produce Safety Alliance website. If you just put in Produce Safety Alliance, the website should pop up. And so do you guys have any questions on the rule? You're all so excited to have it happen and get it over with.
So, who does this pertain to? This United States only?
Oh, good question. The question was, who does it pertain to? The Food Safety Modernization Act actually is for the whole food system, and it's for things that are coming into the United States also. So there's a foreign verification process. Yes, it's not just for the US. Good question.
We don't grow that stuff in the US.
Correct. So it pertains to all of those things. Correct. Good. It contains to human food, for animal food. There's a transportation portion of the Food Safety Modernization Act. There's 7 different parts to it. Excellent question. Any other questions?
So if
So is there an enforcement component? At the present time, many of the states are still in the process of hiring or will be hiring inspectors. And the hope is that inspectors, depending on each state, it could be different from state to state. The hope is that it's first more of a dialogue on how do we get there, what do we need to do, versus an enforcement, write you up. Roger, you may address that a little bit for Washington.
Yeah, the 5-year grant that we applied for and received does have a regulatory enforcement aspect to it. The timeline of that one, FDA seems to think that there's going to be inspections taking place next year. In fact, one of the meetings we just went to, the one that we can get 100% done next year. That just isn't going to happen. And then part of the thing is for the legislative process, we need some guidance. With two masters, in the sense we got the grant from the FDA, what they want, that doesn't mean the state of Washington thinks that we're going to do all that. So the legislature is going to weigh in on this based on the proposals, and there's a whole process for this. So I don't see an enforcement part of us coming out with a checklist. And if we do, it'll be courtesy inspections and kind of, so you know what the deal is. As far as anything bad happening, that's years away. Having said that, if there's a real imminent public health issue, we have embargo authority right now. We can go out there and stop it. I don't really see it so much in this industry. I've seen it in the food industry. I was in food safety for a number of years. I wouldn't never say never, but I have a hard time thinking of scenarios right now where that's going to happen. But that's quite a ways away, and we need to get some things solidified at the state level too. So that's a big part of it. So.
Right. So I think they don't even have a list yet of what they're going to be looking for in inspections. It's not like that comes pre-done. So that's really important to keep in mind. Question?
So how does FSMA dovetail or represent Canada Gap?
So the question was, how does it fit with Canada Gap? Or global gap, or many of the audit systems. There are many things that are very similar, and people who are meeting the gap requirements shouldn't have a huge leap to change, to meet the FSMA requirements. There may be slight changes, but I don't see them as being huge, monstrous changes. That's something people are looking at, trying to see where they can line things up. We know the agriculture water requirements are very different right now, but they may change. So don't panic. That's the bottom line. Okay, I think that's it. So fill out your evaluations, really critical, I know, as all people who plan programs, they're important.
Awesome. Let's give Barbara a big round of applause.